Hi everyone, welcome, bienvenidos. My name is Coda Rayo-Garza and I am the Director of Racial Justice and Gender Equity at YWCA here in San Antonio, Texas, where I work on social justice issues. I'm also a policy advocate, a researcher, and a PhD student of applied demography. And I'm proud to say I am a Truman Political Partner, class of 2018. Thank you for joining us today. For this book talk with Jason Stanford, sponsored by the Truman National Security Project. It's a pleasure to see so many people from many parts of the country join us for this intriguing conversation and discussion on a topic that has garnered national attention, especially in the recent news cycle. So the Truman National Security Project is a high trust impact community for national security leaders. Together, we develop timely, innovative, and principled solutions to preserve and expand democracy, human rights, prosperity, and security around the world. Our diverse membership includes Hill staff, federal employees, nonprofit leaders, academics, industry leaders, political strategists, and elected officials across federal, state, and local government. I have the great pleasure and honor to introduce this discussion today with Jason Stanford, co-author of Forget the Alamo, The Rise and Fall of an American Myth. Jason Stanford is a writer whose bylines have appeared in the Washington Post, Time, Texas Monthly, the Texas Tribune, Texas Highways, the Texas Observer, as well as many other publications. Jason also publishes a Substack newsletter called The Experiment. He lives in Austin, where he works as the Chief of Communications and Community Engagement for the Austin Independent School District. He's a former communications director for Austin Mayor Steve Adler and is also a Truman Political Partner, class of 2012. Jason, welcome.
Thank you, Coda. It's great to be here, and thanks to everyone who's joining.
So let's go ahead and dive right in without further ado. The publication of this book could not come at a better time for both our state and our country. But for folks who haven't yet read the book, talk us through its central thesis.
Sure. It's really simple. We are all taught from John Wayne to the present that the Alamo is a story of glorious self-sacrifice, where a bunch of Anglo settlers came to Texas to defend the Alamo and to slow the dictator Santa Anna's march and buy Sam Houston enough time to win Texas for freedom against tyranny. The only problem is very little of that is actually true. A lot of the white settlers came to Texas originally to farm cotton, and at the time, farming cotton required enslaving people. And as Stephen F. Austin said, nothing is required but money, and that means slaves. Mexico was abolitionists. They were trying to get rid of, after they had won their independence from Spain, they were trying to get rid of slavery. They couldn't settle Texas without getting a bunch of Americans to resettle there. And a bunch of Americans wanted to resettle there and farm cotton. That was the central tension that led to the Texas Revolution. It was basically a fight about slavery. The Texas Revolution was as much about tyranny as the Civil War was about states' rights.
Yeah, and so, one of the things of this book, right, that it really sort of dives into with wonderful detail is the dualism of the Alamo story. We have on one side the heroic Anglo-centric narrative that some continue to push and to preserve versus the true story of the Alamo, of which you just talked a little bit about. Talk to us a little bit about more about that dualism.
Yeah, one thing that surprised us, and it's really honestly just because we're white. We're three white guys, all Texans to some degree. I'm the only non-native Texan who is one of the co-authors. But we all they grew up white in Texas, taking Texas history, learning the whole thing. And I moved here when I was 23. So we all just ingested what we call the heroic Anglo narrative. Most Hispanics in Texas know that's not true. And they're told at home, nah, that's not the way it went down. And as one historian, the godfather of Mexican-American history in Texas told us, is that Texas history takes good little Texans and sorts them into Americans and Mexicans. And that's why, it's a good guy, bad guy story at the Alamo. You got the good guys who are Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, who are two of the biggest celebrities in the country at the time. You got William Barrett Travis, who wrote some florid letters and has immortalized himself as perhaps the world's most unsuccessful correspondent. And versus Santa Anna, who's always been depicted as this horrible tyrant. Not that he was a good guy, but all the Mexicans were the bad guys in the way they tell the story, to the point where at the Alamo, there's no marker for the Mexican army. It is told exclusively from the point of view of the white settlers, and not really the Tejanos. It's only recently that the Tejanos, who are on the side of the white settlers, were included in the story. So it's always been a white guy versus brown guy story. And that teaches Texans that there are good guys and bad guys among us, which explains why when I moved to Texas when I was 23, people referred to Hispanics as Mexicans. And they weren't trying to say that they were citizens of Mexico. They were just of Mexican descent in Texas, but they weren't called Mexican Americans. They weren't called Hispanics or Tejanos. Certainly weren't called Texans. They were called Mexicans. And that's a result of Texas's origin myth, which is this glorious tale of self-sacrifice.
And you talk in your book, you share some of the conversations that you had with folks about just this, about how the experience of the myth was harmful to Tejanos or Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and Chicanos, and how that impacted them as children, even in visiting the Alamo. Do you want to talk a little bit more about some of those conversations that you had?
Yeah. It's really kind of sad, not just visiting the Alamo, but learning it in class. The same guy, Andres Tiarina, the historian that I was referring to, he was a child of migrant workers. And so he was in West Texas when he took Texas state history. And the teacher said, Andy, and his name was Andres, but she could not manage that. But she said, Andy, stand up. And he's the only brown kid in class. And she said, Andy's grandparents killed Davy Crockett. They were explicitly told at one time that they killed Davy Crockett. And when he was telling me the story, his wife was sitting next to him, and she grew up in South Texas. And she said, yeah, we were all told we killed Davy Crockett, and I wanted to crawl under my desk. It's just, they are told that they are Texas's Christ killers, that they were the bad guys in original sin, which doesn't, it explains why Mexican Americans in Texas have for more than a century been second-class citizens in a land that used to be Texas.
And it's difficult to, push back against people's real life experiences, things that we felt or that our families felt and experienced in real life. And really, the work that you're doing is in presenting the truth, the facts behind the story of the Alamo. So that leads me to something else that I highlighted in your book that I thought was especially important and impactful, was in mapping out the history and the role that Texas historians played in the spreading and perpetuating the myth of the Alamo, right? So the way that you all connected these back to, well, fundamentally they were believers, right? So if you can talk a little bit more about the role that academia played in pushing this narrative about the Alamo.
Sure. And it's ironic that you bring it up today, because yesterday the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, has called on the University of Texas to convene a panel of historians to debunk our book. That the irony there isn't that it's a foolish idea for politicians to attack individual books as a means of shutting them down. The irony is that the University of Texas was the academic institution that for a long time was enforcing the myth of the Alamo. And initially it was a revenge myth. Remember, the Alamo was something that Sam Houston's troops yelled out to get them to go kill Santa Anna's army. And then the problem is everyone there who was American died. Excepting, of course, for a woman and an enslaved man who weren't considered the most credible people at the time. There were a lot of contemporary histories taken from the Alamo by Mexicans, and they weren't included for a long time. And for a long time, the history of the Alamo was told by amateurs, people who were hobbyists, and they wanted to puff up and sell books with the romantic notion of the Alamo. So by the time it got to academia, it had been corrupted as a story, and there wasn't a lot of good original source material. But it became a bit of a boosterish subject where you had to tell the good guys versus the bad guys story in order to establish Texas as this was part of Texas's effort not to be known as a Confederate state, but a Western state. So you had to tell the cowboy story. You had to tell the hero story. We weren't, part of the defeated Confederacy. We were victorious people who stood up. Texas, the reaction to the insurrection is exactly the way Texas has always acted in the face of these things. We refuse to see the Alamo as a defeat, which is a case like, I think about half of Texans aren't really sure who won the Battle of the Alamo, just that we were the good guys. And I think it was a couple of years, Juneteenth happened a couple of years after the end of the Civil War because we refused to give up here in Texas. The last battle of the Civil War was several months after the end of the war. Texans just really, it's not only that we don't know when we're defeated, we think there is some glory in losing in this way. And we have done this way in teaching the history of the Alamo for a long, long time. And it continues to this day, to where the politicians are fighting the onslaught of history.
Yeah, and in one of the chapters, you start out with a quote from a state representative, I think it is, sort of alluding to history should be written in a way that it falls in line with the Southern sentiments, with the beliefs of, the myth of the Alamo. But, another piece of the book that I found particularly interesting was the connection. And this happens in your telling of especially LBJ, right? And the role he played. But you mentioned how this the Alamo transcended from just being a Texan symbol to being about American nationalism. Talk a little bit more about how you drew that line from, the myth of the Alamo and how it became embedded in foreign policy.
Right. So that actually starts with John Wayne. We've had big defeats have always been used to justify further violence. Pearl Harbor, Thermopylae, all that stuff. But with the Alamo, John Wayne, one, he'd always wanted to tell the story in a movie, and two, he thought John Kennedy was a fraud. And both of those things coincided with his movie in 1960. And it really, really made John Wayne angry that John F. Kennedy used a ghostwriter for his book that he got so much acclaim for. I don't know what it is with the Alamo and books, but apparently people just don't think they mix. And in any case, so the tagline in his advertising for the Alamo movie was, "There were no ghostwriters at the Alamo," which, if you think about it, is a really terrible tagline for the movie. But that movie was bad anyway, so it didn't really matter. In any case, the movie talked about how this is a mission that became a fort, and a fort that became a legend or some such like that. And John Kennedy came to town, to San Antonio, to give a speech for his campaign. And he opened the speech he was at the Alamo, and he talked about it was this, I'm talking to you at a mission that became a fort, and a fort that became a legend. Like, he quoted him right back. It was a very primitive rap battle that they were having. In any case, the legend at the Alamo goes that John F. Kennedy, there's a big crowd, and he had to get to San Antonio. And he had to get to Houston to give a speech to a bunch of preachers, which is actually important, and we're going to get to. But he was trying to avoid the crowd so he could get on the plane. And he asked one of the daughters of the Republic of Texas, is there a back door at the Alamo? And she said, "At the Alamo, there are no back doors, only heroes," which is a bunch of hooey because there are tons of back doors at the Alamo. In any case, he got to Houston, gives a speech in front of all these preachers, and churchmen, really, of all denominations. And if you recall, at the time, the big question with John Kennedy wasn't whether or not he had ghostwriters, but that he was Catholic, and people were worried that he was going to take orders from the Pope and not follow the Constitution. Well, he cited the Alamo in his speech to them, said there were people from all over the world and all different religions at the Alamo, and no one ever gave them a religious test. Well, that effectively ended the question, and he got elected president by about that much, winning Texas, of course. So that was the first time that the Alamo became part of the national political discussion, and it continues to this day. LBJ Oddly, to give you an idea about how heroic and how virtuous Texans view the Alamo, not only did LBJ never stop lying about having familial connections to the people who died at the Alamo, and when he was caught in a lie by Doris Kearns Goodwin, he came up with a new kind of lie that she never caught him in. It's a fun little trail. But he kept comparing Vietnam to the Alamo, saying and using that to justify further sending more boys to Vietnam. Using a military precedent where everyone dies and is defeated and wiped out doesn't seem like the wisest course of action, but that tells you just how valorous Texans see the Alamo. And to his credit, George W. Bush never did that with Afghanistan and Iraq. But we were told by a historian, a former curator of the Alamo, that a ton of veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq came back to the Alamo after serving and toured and showed pictures of their little encampments over there that they'd named the Alamo. It is embedded in how we see ourselves as a military culture.
It's amazing because, from even just misunderstanding, how Tejas came to be, right? Like that there were sort of these permanent squatters, the Americans, that they were, as you've talked about before, right? Illegally crossing. So I'm gonna rewind us back to that piece, because I think, as you also well talked about, a lot of the sort of bravery from the Battle of San Jacinto comes, it's latched on to the Alamo, but there's stuff that happened before that. And so I'm going to ask you to go back and talk to us a little bit about the situation. What really happened?
So the Texas was Comanche country at the time, and it was a Mexican state. And ultimately, after Mexico won independence from Spain, they were worried about losing northern Mexico, which is Texas, to the United States, and with good reason. So they tried to get settlers, and they gave away huge swaths of land. Entire Austin Colony was one of the first ones, to people called empresarios, people who would come in, settle some land, and encourage other immigrants to come here. Well, very quickly, over a couple of decades, Mexico figured out that no one was speaking much Spanish or going to mass up in Texas, and they were overrun by white dudes. And so that was one of the motivations for cutting off slavery. And because it's not that they were doing it cynically, it's not that they were pro-slavery in South Mexico, they just always made allowances for the American immigrants to have slaves. And so they said, well, let's cut off slavery and cut off immigration. So ironically, the first illegal immigrants in Texas were from Tennessee and Alabama, and the first wetbacks crossed the Sabine. So this is not something that people particularly like acknowledging here in Texas, and I never fail to never fail to enjoy telling people that.
Well, that's appreciated. So that actually leads me well into, another sort of question, right? As the story of the Alamo is often, and the history of the state of Texas, mistold. Some of the Tejanos that played a role in the history are left out, right? So we tell this watered down, whitewashed version of the history. Can you talk about some of those Tejanos, some of those folks that played critical roles?
Yeah, there's a one in particular. The great hero of Texas should be Juan Seguin. He led the cavalry at the Battle of San Jacinto, and he was sent from the Alamo to get Sam Houston to send troops to the Alamo, and Sam Houston said nah. So he was at the Alamo. He was this huge revolutionary hero here, and then he became the mayor of San Antonio. And then he became a tragic figure because he started actually enforcing the laws, which, when there were conflicts between Tejano landowners and angry American immigrants, the angry American immigrants were willing to enjoy extrajudicial procedures to obtain land. And eventually he was run out. He retreated to his ranch where he and some friends kept attackers at bay, and he had to leave and go to Mexico. It's what happened to Juan Seguin happened to tons of Tejano landowners in Texas, which is how a lot of South Texas Tejano ranchers became South Texas Tejano migrant workers. And and those stories get told on generations that, our family used to own this land and now we have to pick their fruit. So that is the Texas Revolution is inherently a story about ethnic cleansing and tragedy that happened to Tejanos. It's a deeply romantic story, and it's much more interesting that way than what happened to a couple of hundred dudes over 13 days in San Antonio in 1836.
You're right. Growing up, I remember my dad telling me, esta era nuestra tierra, in English, meaning this was our land.
Yep.
And so, but the collective, this sort of like latching on this collective memory of the select people of the population, the belief in this myth, they are in the state's top offices now, right?
Yeah.
What are they so afraid of? What is it? What is the resistance? Where does that come from? And actually, I think this is a question we got in the chat. Anyways, asking why do they feel threatened? So why are folks today so threatened by the truth of the past?
A couple of things, I think. So if the creation myth was that my people came here and they were good guys and they stuck up for great things, then that embeds in how I see myself. And then if the truth is, at best, things were more complicated, and at worst, we were fighting for slavery, then maybe I'm not so good. So it goes right to your identity as a Texan, or as a white Texan, to be more accurate. Something else occurred to me the other day when I was talking about this. We're talking about virtuous self-sacrifice in the face of knowing violent death to buy time so that others may live a better life. That's the Jesus story, is what we're telling ourselves here. We're telling ourselves a Christ story. And if you're telling yourself the Christ story, then whatever you do is good and you are holy. And maybe we're just as messed up as everyone else in the world, which that having to admit that perhaps we are flawed and we have some things to work on is a hard thing for white people in America to do, because then we have to admit that we're not top of the food chain, or at least we shouldn't be.
And what a hard thing for some folks to ponder, right? And the other part of Claire's question is, have you found an effective way to convince folks that acknowledging the truth of the past does not need to threaten them today?
Yeah, I think it's in the stories we tell. And so we're not trying to say that Texas is bad. What we're trying to say is, Texas is big enough to handle the truth of how we started, and because we can't keep telling two different stories. We can't tell the heroic Anglo narrative that is at odds with historical truth, where now all the historians we talk to of any note admit that slavery had a big role in this. And we can't also at the same time have our Hispanic population, which is rapidly becoming the majority of Texas, tell themselves a different story, or at least be confused for a large part by the dominant story. There's a poll that came out early last year, showed Hispanics are more likely not to know who won the Battle of the Alamo than white people are, which shocked. White people can tell themselves this glorious tale of self-sacrifice, but we're not really telling a coherent story. And so if we're not telling a coherent story that includes all of our populations, then we're going to have separate populations in a state where if Texas does something wrong, Oklahoma can have a bad year and no one will notice. Texas has a bad day and it really screws things up around here. So we need to get our story straight. And we need to tell a story that includes everyone. And having to make room in that truth, it requires putting your ego aside and working together. And right now people are just too interested in us versus them and good guys versus bad guys to try to tell a story that includes everyone. It's not difficult to tell a story about redemption and about how people tell the same story about the Civil War, that is brother versus brother, and that we healed and that we tried to heal. And some of the healing story is a myth, but at least you can tell a story about redemption and healing. People aren't even trying with Texas.
And in your book, you sort of walk folks through to sort of where we are in recent times, right? With the Alamo and reimagining the Alamo, or re-envisioning the Alamo, and bringing different groups to the table. Walk us through that, and
Sure.
and really sort of like an honest perspective of where are we really with these efforts to reimagine or re-envision, retell the story of the Alamo.
Yeah, so this whole book project started out because Chris Tomlinson, one of the co-authors, was writing a column about the redevelopment of the Alamo and about how they were planning on spending $500 million to fix it up and build a great new museum for Phil Collins' stuff. And I should pause. Yes, that Phil Collins. Phil Collins, the lead singer of Genesis, the former drummer, he became the world's the collector of he had the world's largest collection of what people thought was Alamo memorabilia, and he needed a place to put it. And there was one of his conditions was you can't take some of it, you have to display all of it. And no museum wanted to do that because that's just not how you do that. And the Texas state government said, oh, sure, we'll do that. And so that set in motion a $500 million plan to fix up the Alamo. If any of you have ever been to the Alamo, you've probably had a similar reaction. You probably thought, oh, is that all there is? The average time people spend at the Alamo is about 11 minutes. It's an underwhelming historical site. People spend more time at Ripley's, believe it or not, across the street than they do at the Alamo. And for good reason. There's stuff to do at Ripley's that's kind of fun. But it's underwhelming. And the actual Alamo footprint is a city street that people drive on. It has no sense of what the actual site is. So people thought, why don't we reimagine this site? Well, to conservatives, reimagining the Alamo sounded like taking down Confederate statues. So in the process of redeveloping, the Alamo became a de facto Confederate monument, to the extent that when the Texas legislature was passing laws banning the removal of Confederate statues, people started including some of the monuments like the cenotaph at the Alamo in there, even though it clearly had nothing to do with the Civil War or the Confederacy in that way. So now we have this big fight about how are we going to redevelop the Alamo and build a museum. And so as anyone who's ever done local government knows, you have to have a committee of citizens to come up with a vision and strategic plan. And they did. They came up with this great plan that was, for the first time, including everyone at the table. And they talked about including the whole history of the time that the Franciscans came 300 years ago and had the indigenous populations build the dang place, and that the indigenous population is buried out there in front of the Alamo. That there are several missions in San Antonio, which used to be the outer reaches of the Spanish Empire. Every other mission is classified by the State Historical Society as a cemetery because that's where the indigenous people are buried. Alamo is the only place that's not classified as a cemetery because you would have to shut down a lot of downtown San Antonio if it were. In any case, that brought up this huge conflict between, are we going to tell the whole story or are we going to tell the story of 13 days? And in the rise of the conservative backlash to George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, the 13 days people won. George P. Bush is the state office holder who has jurisdiction over the Alamo. He's the nephew and grandson of presidents and near namesake. And he started out talking about how this was going to be a great idea. We could talk about the whole history of the place and slavery. And, he's a former history teacher. He's not dumb. And he's not dumb when it comes to politics because he saw poll numbers and he switched to, we have to tell the glorious history of those 13 days. And so now $500 million is going to be spent into teaching the heroic Anglo narrative of what didn't happen all those years ago, and to display Phil Collins's stuff, which people have raised significant questions about its authenticity. So that all seems actually kind of perfect for the situation.
Yeah, and we have a really good question that aligns really well from Shanae. She asks, how do we tell this new story and truth as a Spanish-speaking South? And I think this connects also very nicely with some of the conversations that you also had that, to some Tejanos, it's the Alamo. It's not, it doesn't really matter that much.
Yeah,
I would say that that's true, somewhat true about my parents, but sort of their sons and daughters, myself included, right? It aligns with some of that. The start of the sort of revision is history and wanting to sort of take back our narrative. So to Shanae's question, how would you answer her question about how do we tell this new story and truth as a Spanish-speaking South?
yeah, Sinead, that's a really good question. One and Coda, I'd be interested to see if this is, your family's reaction. Jose Menendez is the state senator who represents the Alamo. It's kind of funny, like if you get elected in downtown San Antonio, part of your district is the Alamo. And so when he was first elected, he got a bus and filled it with some important people in his district and took them around on a tour of the district. And for a lot of these people, leaders in the state Senate district in downtown San Antonio, it had been the only time in their lives they'd ever been to the Alamo. By the way we tell the story, it is just white people's business, and people tune it out. For a lot of times, Mexican Americans didn't study the Alamo because that was white people's history. And people, Mexican Americans in San Antonio, they see it as a place where they can get raspas. And previous generations caught the bus at the Woolworths, and they still remember the potato donuts there. But the Alamo, that's just that's other people's story. They don't realize it's part of their story too. And I think some of that is how it's taught in school. But I think a lot of it is that the orientation, it can't be about this famous battle that's mistaught and that we're going to expand the aperture to include everyone. For among boomers, a lot of the fight has been, we have to tell that Tejanos were heroes too, instead of this basically was a secessionist movement for slavery. That's not something that Tejanos should be super proud of being a part of. So I think New Mexico might be a good guide. My boys and I were just out there last week, and it's real clear that that they tell the history from the time that the Spanish showed up, and even before then, that they tell it, from when the land was settled, and not from when the land was settled by white people. And I think telling that story from the beginning is much more interesting than telling the story midway through and then insisting that everything happened before that was boring.
Right. And there's just so many intricacies, right? Like down to when the state started investing dollars into the Alamo, and the two women behind that, right?
Yes.
The Zavala who wrote the bill. Talk a little bit more about that piece. I found that piece also very interesting, very dramatic, but it was very interesting, and again, a part of history that we don't really talk about too much.
Yeah, one of the reasons that we know the history wrong is because of this fight that happens. Adina de Zavala was a descendant from de Zavala, who helped write the Declaration of Independence, whose name is on the state history archives. And so she had this real urge to preserve the Alamo and the lung barracks where the worst fighting took place. And she had an interest in restoring the site. And she started talking about this in San Antonio, and everyone said, "Oh, you got to meet Claire Driscoll." And Claire Driscoll was a wealthy socialite whose interest was in turning the Alamo into a European park in the middle of town. And it's amazing how often that conversation keeps happening in San Antonio. So yeah, she had the money. And they kept fighting, and so because she was able, Claire Driscoll had money and political connections, she won that fight and got the governor in 1905 to sign a bill putting the Daughters of the Republic of Texas in charge of the Alamo. And I don't think we're going to need any more proof in human history that a lineage organization is ill-suited to take care of a historical site. they were not enthusiastic about making repairs. But in any case, Adina de Zavala had a lot of fight in her. Oh boy. At one time, she locked herself inside the Alamo, inside the Long Barracks, to try to, because Clara was out of town, so she was trying to do a power play, and her supporters were throwing sandwiches and oranges through the windows to keep her fed while she was effectively trying to hold out in the Alamo. People keep trying to hold out in the Alamo, and it never works out for them.
Yeah. And in your books, one of the sentences I remember, and I'm paraphrasing, is, the Alamo was different things to different people throughout time, but always really, it was not fully its true story. So there's so many, eye-opening pieces to this book, but you as a co-author, as a white man, what were some of the most sort of, eye-opening parts of this writing journey for you, where you sort of had to stop and really digest what you were learning, and think about it? If you want to share a little bit.
I'm Gen X. First time anyone mentions the Alamo to me when I first moved to Texas, of course, you know what I'm thinking. I'm thinking Pee Wee Herman. Someone my age, the Alamo's just been a laugh line. And as it turns out, by the way, there is a damn basement there. I know, I feel lied to as well. It's been used as a joke line among Gen X. It's been sort of this provincial chest beating for a bunch of white boomers. And it seems like something that Texas has latched onto to say it's exceptional. Not seems, it is very clearly, which I'm a little suspicious of. And so I didn't really regard it that seriously. And I thought this would just be a fun book to write, saying, oh, there was no line in the sand, or Davy Crockett didn't really go down swinging old Betsy and piling up Mexican bodies around him. But it turns out that what we were doing was unpacking something that had been quite painful for generations of Mexican Americans and Tejanos in Texas, because this had been a story that had turned them into bad guys in their own neighborhoods. And once we started, talked about that historian who said that Andy was made to stand up and told that his people killed Davy Crockett. You hear it once and you go, oh, I'll be damned. We kept hearing it, and people either got angry about it or they got apathetic, and they were told that Texas wasn't really theirs and that they weren't really part of that Texas story. And so they disengaged. Even people who were really engaged in politics just thought, oh, that's other people. And it's a frightening thing to contemplate, being written out of your own story and to be othered in a place where it was yours. And that's when I realized that we had a greater responsibility than I realized, than I'd anticipated. And then when you start getting into it, you realize all these, once in the 70s and 80s, Hispanic academics and artists and historians started telling people this. And of course, the white culture wasn't listening. But part of the responsibility we had was to say that there was a consensus among historians, first Hispanic and now white historians too, that this is the way the story is told, and it's been blocked from the people by politicians. And they will fight into the night to insist that the defenders of the Alamo are taught to Texas school children as heroic. And there is nothing else in the Texas curriculum where you're required to teach a seventh grader that they were heroic, not the people who liberated Europe, not the astronauts who stepped on the moon, not anyone in the entire human history, not even Jesus Christ himself is described as heroic, except for the defenders of the Alamo in Texas. And that's the will, that they're willing to brainwash children to keep this myth alive. And we realized that we had to tell that story. But even that wasn't the biggest surprise, Gato. The biggest surprise was writing about all of these incidents all the time, where these politicians are yelling at books and using movies to tell it to tell the story their way. And wouldn't you know, we put out this book, and I thought, okay, cool. And a politician starts trying to censor our book and attack, and we become part of the story we've been written about the whole time. It felt like our timeline had merged with the book, and it was a very odd feeling.
Good. Well, we do have some questions here starting to pile up. So let me ask you one from Teresa. She said, she's asking, I'm wondering if you've explored parallels to California's history, particularly around the mission system. There is a similar reckoning that needs to happen with that historical narrative.
No, I haven't, but that's really interesting. Yeah, we saw the missions. It's, as a tourist, you go to another town and you see their old missions or their old ruins, and they look at history without context is just tourism, and it's fun. Oh, look at the old mission, look how old it is. And I remember I took an USSI with my boys in front of the oldest church in the United States in Santa Fe the other day. And after having written about the Alamo, I wonder who built it, and I wonder if the indigenous people who built it were enslaved, and if they were given burials there, or just thrown in a hole. These pretty buildings we look at and we go tour often have these frightening histories behind them. But no, I have not looked in California at all.
To be continued, right? Next part. We have a question from Colin. He says the authors reference Stephen F. Austin sending letters to and traveling to Mexico City multiple times, attempting to preserve slavery. Is there solid evidence of these documents and or events? And if so, how can your detractors deny this confirmed historical record?
So what they say, and we don't, and Coda, you've read the book, so catch me if I'm wrong, but we're not saying that slavery is the only cause. We're saying it is a cause. And absent slavery, they might have avoided the whole thing to begin with. There were other states. What the detractors say is, well, other states were rebelling against Santa Anna too, which, but we're talking about the Alamo. And absent slavery, I don't think the white people would have gotten involved in the Alamo, or the entire Texas Revolution. They do not doubt the authenticity of Stephen F. Austin's correspondence from Mexico City when he's talking about lobbying the Mexican government to carve out loopholes for slavery for them. He was a good negotiator. LBJ would have been proud about all the arms he twisted, and to the extent where he got himself thrown in prison and still got a loophole carved out for Texas, which you got to admire the man's pluck. But that said, the detractors they say that we just don't include all the other stuff, and that once you include all the other stuff, that what we're really we're making too much of slavery, frankly, is what they're saying. And we're not discounting the other reasons that led to the Texas Revolt. What we're saying is that slavery, made the Texas Revolt, or at least the Anglo participation in the Texas Revolt, inevitable. And that when we tell the story, slavery always seems to get left out. We don't leave out, actually we do kind of leave out slavery as a cause of the Civil War a lot of times. I was raised in Washington State, and I had a high school teacher look me in the eye and said the cause of the Civil War was states' rights. So we do this, but it's kind of hard to hide the role of slavery in the Civil War. We've done a great job hiding the role of slavery in the Texas Revolt.
Yeah, and I think you pointed out in your book where you say that they were looking to create a slavocracy.
And they did.
Yeah, and they did.
The Texas Constitution specifically and explicitly wrote slavery into it, and they said you can never be emancipated, and if you are a free black man walking into Texas, you are suddenly enslaved. It was at one point, Texas, for the 10 years it existed as a republic, was the worst slavocracy in the entire world.
Absolutely. We have a question from Destiny. She asks, can you talk a little more about this theme of losers being glorified in American history? It's so strange, isn't it? But it's not a coincidence that folks are lumping the Alamo and Confederate statues together. How do these symbols operate with such resilience, and what is changing now that makes you feel optimistic?
Optimism. Destiny, that's a great question. So there is a historian, Plotkin, I think his name is. He has a theory about regenerative violence, that a defeat is often used to justify further violence, and that this has been a constant theme in westward expansion of our continent. The Alamo being one, Pearl Harbor is the most famous example, that, you know, when you suffer this defeat, that it makes further violence to justify their sacrifice imperative. I don't think it's invented by us, but I think it has been a constant theme of the growth of the American empire. Remember the Maine, like pretty much anything they ask us to remember. Never forget 9/11 as the most recent example. So the Confederacy is a deeper thing of that's a little bit more like January 6th, that they don't want to believe they really lost. I remember I went to visit my wife's southern aunt and uncle in a place called Franklin, Tennessee. I wasn't in their house for 10 minutes before her uncle was telling me that if General Hoo-Ha had zigged instead of zagged at Gettysburg, that they would have won the Civil War. I don't remember bringing up Gettysburg. And I'm unlikely to bring up the Civil War at all in the South. But they keep playing. There is a subroutine going on in a Southern white man's mind about how this all could have been different. My friend Sam Gwynn wrote a great book about Stonewall Jackson, and he was at the Texas Book Fair. And most of his questions were hypothetical, what-if questions about a Civil War battle. If Stonewall Jackson had gone up the hill instead of down the hill, do you think they would have won the war? That kind of thing. People aren't trying to understand the history. They're trying to understand a way out of their history here. And I don't know how we fix that. There are two schools of thought. One is the German South American model, South African model. In South Africa, they did the Justice and Reconciliation or Commission? Yeah, they had a reconciliation commission to talk about apartheid, and similar to what they did at Nuremberg, except in Germany, they keep telling the story of the Holocaust, where conscripts, they have mandatory conscription into the armed services there, and every conscript has to learn it over and over again about what happened in the Holocaust. So they keep teaching their history and indoctrinate their people in what actually happened. So government can play a productive role in enforcing a view of history. The other view is there like a doctrine of forgetting after the Spanish Civil War, where they just kind of agreed, we're not going to bring that up. We're not going to prosecute any war crimes. We're not going to blame anyone. We're also just not going to sit around. We're just going to wipe the slate clean. Let's move on. That has an absurdist charm to me, but I'm not sure that would work. Yeah, I don't know what to do about people who keep waving the Confederate battle flag, except to maybe at some point we'll get the majority opinion in this country together and say that that is a flag of traitors and enemies, and perhaps ban it. There is an ingrained fear and repulsion among Americans to ban symbols, to restrict any kind of speech, and I think that's laudable. But I think giving space for symbols of white supremacy is not working out for us too well, and maybe we ought to get it to get at white supremacy. We have to go after the symbols too.
Absolutely. Jaime has a really good question for you. I hope you're ready. Jaime is asking, what role has the pressure for Latinos to assimilate into mainstream American society played into the perpetuation of this myth?
Okay.
I told you it was a good question.
We're gonna actually have to talk about this. All right, so there's a reason that they say non-Hispanic white, right? Hispanics are technically white people, which is a concept I have to like really keep reminding myself, because in Texas they're treated like second-class citizens. But there can be, but there's the sort of the carrot they dangle with you here in Texas, that if you assimilate, you can really become a white person. You can become a part of mainstream culture. And my wife and I had a friend, there's a way that conservatives think about this, that they separate the good ones from the bad ones. And I remember we were at a pool of a friend of mine who is a Republican operative, and he referred to a very wealthy South Texas Hispanic as a dirty Mexican. And so they think of the ones who are dirty and clean, the ones who are brown, and the ones who have really become white. I think it's just, and then when the rewards for becoming white are assimilation into society and acceptance, and you're able to operate with greater freedom economically and socially, then I think it would be impossible for me, if I were in that position, not to feel the pull of assimilation, and to maybe drop my accent or become Andy instead of Andres. And it puts the Hispanic population in Texas into a really tough situation, where now I understand, after having written this book and lived here for so long, why so many of the Hispanic activists on the Democratic side are just pissed off. I get it. And I don't know the solution to that, but except to perhaps not think that the end result of someone's successful development as a person is to become white.
Yeah, it's very sad, and we only have 8 minutes but there's so much more there to unpack for sure. But I'm going to ask you one last question before our time runs out.
Cool.
In the end, is this really about forgetting the Alamo, or is it about asking folks to remember or to relearn the true story of the Alamo?
Yeah, so part of the problem with the redevelopment of the Alamo is, like I talked about, okay, we'll start with the story that we all know, and then we'll widen the aperture. Well, if you start with the story, then you're starting from a wrong place. So let's forget what we know. Let's forget all that, and let's just start with what happened. Let's not start with our feelings about it. Let's not start with how our identities relate to that story a long time ago, or what we want to be true. Let's just tell the story like it happened, and then go from there. I think there is a starting over that is required. I mean, no, I don't think there are people who argue that militarily the Alamo was an insignificant battle. The amateur justification for it was that they bought Sam Houston time over 13 days. Well, at the end of the siege, Santa Anna's army was still marching up from Mexico. That was a long march. And so they could have, Santa Anna's army could have left a couple of cannon and 1,000 men around the Alamo and just trapped him there while they just kept marching. There was no reason to stop at the Alamo for Santa Anna. And the delay didn't allow his entire army to catch up. So in that sense, you could say, forget it, it's insignificant. But culturally, it has become so ingrained in who we are as Texans that I think what we're really saying is, let's just take a fresh look at it, where we're all in the story together, and there aren't good guys or bad guys.
So I lied. I'm going to ask you one more question. and then we can close out. This, right, Texas, like many other states right now, there's so much happening, some bad legislation. With all of this in mind, parents, teachers, what role, what can they do in ensuring that future generations are telling the true story of the Alamo?
So the legislature just passed something creating what's called the 1836 Project, in which the governor is going to have a panel of historians ensuring that they are teaching a patriotic version of history. And as a Russian major, this sets off a lot of alarm bells for me, that are alleviated only somewhat by the fact that one of the main duties of the 1836 project will be to print out a pamphlet that will be given out at the DMV when people get driver's licenses. So I'm not sure how effective it's going to be. But with all this talk about critical race theory, very clearly a lot of Karens, to use a colloquial shorthand, are going to feel empowered to report on teachers who aren't hewing to the political version of history. And so what parents and regular citizens need to do is the front lines on this now are becoming 7th grade classrooms. And it is frightening what could happen. Just in the same way that the voter suppression bill in Texas would empower the Proud Boys to serve as voting monitors, very close to voters. The critical race theory bills and the civics bill, they called it, will empower parents and interest groups then to spy on teachers and to try to catch them in telling the truth. This is going to be really tough. And so what we need are parents arming their kids with the truth to stick up for teachers. And we're going to have to do a lot. We're going to be fighting this fight in a lot of ditches around Texas soon.
Jason Stanford is the co-author of Forget the Alamo, The Rise and Fall of an American Myth. My name is Coda Rayo-Garza. You have just spent almost an hour with us discussing his book and the importance of the true story of the Alamo. Thank you for joining us today. We have a lot of events on deck this summer, so please be sure to check out our Twitter for more events. That's at Truman Project, and you can find Jason. What's your hashtag, Jason, on Twitter?
My handle is JAS Stanford, and the hashtag is Forget the Alamo.
Yes, handle and hashtag. Good. Very good. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope that you'll go out and get the book, read it, and have a conversation with someone about the book and about the Alamo. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.